It's fascinating to see how the celestial, the cosmic perspective, how that finds expression in the landscape of the ancient world. The seven mountains, mountain passes to the north, there's the seven planets actually, and that's where the idea of the seven heavens originated. And according to St. Paul, he traveled past some of these heavens and eventually he reached paradise, which corresponds with the Garden of Eden in the north.
What if the first kings of Sumer were the Bible's Nephilim, giant half-god rulers who built the world's first empires? Today we dive into Vili's The Nephilim Kings of an Epic Age. Welcome to our podcast. So Vili, how did you first get interested in the Nephilim, and what made you decide to write this book after years of studying ancient history?
Yes, so I was from early on, many years ago, I already started out with an interest in the ancient world, especially the origins of the biblical tradition and the primeval history that we find in Genesis chapter 1 to 11 was always fascinating to me, trying to really understand and the origins. Where did it originate? That was always a question on my mind, and I think many others also struggle with that. And while working on that, I came to the conclusion that there's a lot of Mesopotamian material in this primeval history. And once I discovered the amount of Mesopotamian material, it made sense to me that according to the primeval history, and just at the end of that, we find that the story of Abram also started in Sumer, in the city of Ur. So I brought these together and I argued in a published academic article that the Abrahamic family actually brought the original source material for the primeval history from Sumer with them when they traveled from Ur to Canaan. And that in that sense, it's actually a prehistory of the Abrahamic family, of the forebears who lived in that land, in that ancient land of Sumer, which is called Shinar in the Bible. And so then I really got into, when I developed this interest with regard to the ancient Mesopotamian world, and especially Sumer. I attended the Sumerian reading class. We read for a few years. I read with some others the Sumerian cuneiform texts. That was a wonderful period. And from that time on, I was really interested in the Sumerian world and how everything came together. It occupied me for quite a few years studying that. So that's fascinating. And while studying the Sumerian traditions and also later on the Akkadian traditions, which we'll come to, I discovered the important role that the Nephilim played in the Sumerian texts. I discovered Gilgamesh was presented as a Nephilim, as having a supernatural birth, being born from a diamond, a spiritual being. I discovered that the house of Uruk, the earliest house that came after the deluge in the Sumerian king lists, one of the most important the first important Sumerian dynasty. That this dynasty actually believed themselves to have been scions of the gods. Yeah. So when I discovered that, immediately I started bringing all these things together. It was not only that the biblical tradition originated in Sumer, a large part of that actually, but that they had a shared tradition in that ancient world, and that certain figures in the biblical tradition, for example, Adam or Enoch, later on Nimrod, and so forth, that all of these biblical figures had an equivalent, a counterpart in Sumerian tradition, because it goes back to the same original world and the same historical tradition.
Yeah, Willie, and it came
And
together
also-
under the Sumerian hypothesis. If people wanted to look that up,
Yeah. So in that context, the Nephilim, I believe that it's mentioned in the biblical tradition, and it's also in the ancient Sumerian and other ancient and old traditions, but especially in the Sumerian tradition. And I think that's where my interest really started in this topic.
So Willie, just to sort of build on that, you use a new way to date ancient events in your book. And what inspired that new timeline, and how does it change what we thought we knew?
Well, studying the ancient Middle Eastern world, I saw that the biblical chronology, especially in the Masoretic text, it's basically impossible to correlate the chronology in the Masoretic text with the secular chronologies of the ancient world. So if you would try to correlate the biblical and the extra-biblical, the ancient Sumerian world, for example, then this is a great obstacle. But what I discovered is that
it's a shortened timeline.
Yeah. So what I then discovered is that the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation that was made about 250 before Christ, very early on in Egypt, from the best manuscript, that this translation also used by the early church until about the 4th century. I discovered that the chronology in this translation is actually very consistent with the secular chronologies.
Yes.
And once I discovered that, it opened a totally new field of study, because now we could really correlate the biblical traditions and ancient history with what we find outside the Bible in the extra-biblical traditions, and especially with regard to this very early period. For example, the time of Abram. Before that time, it was very difficult to place Abram in an exact context. But once we find that this, for example, one of the events during the time of Abram was the Elamite invasion into Canaan. And until not too long ago, scholars just thought that was just impossible. It didn't happen. But since that time, we have discovered very good evidence in the Maori texts, and we had a discussion on that in some detail at some point.
And how do the flood dates compare, Willie?
Yeah, so let me just finish this. So clearly, what is important here is that now Abram can be set in a particular historical context that's consistent with secular history, and the same with regard to the deluge. So, for example, in the Septuagint, there are various dates for the deluge, but the two dates, most important dates, is about 3000 and something before BC, and the other about 3300 BC. Some suggest even a slightly earlier date. And these dates are quite consistent with secular history if we use the lower chronology for the Uruk period. Because if we assume that the biblical deluge is the deluge that is spoken of in all the other Middle Eastern traditions, in the Sumerian tradition, the Akkadian tradition, the Babylonian tradition, then most likely this event is the one discovered by Sir Woolley in the city of Ur. And in the lower chronology, that dates to about 3500 BC. So these two dates, the biblical and the extra-biblical dates, are quite consistent with each other. Now, the lower chronology, that's actually based on the Egyptian low chronology. We have two chronologies in Egyptian history, the lower and the higher chronology. And the lower chronology, that's the one I'm talking about. When one takes that as basis and proceed further back in history towards the Uruk period, then we find the lower chronology consistent with the biblical Septuagint tradition. So now we can actually correlate the biblical and the extra-biblical traditions far back in history, before and after the deluge, in the antediluvian and post-diluvian period, before and after the Great Flood. So that opens up totally new opportunities for understanding the ancient world and tradition and the setting of the biblical tradition is.
Yeah, Beautiful. And we've had some discussion around the lower chronology as well for those that are listening to this for the first time. Sort of page through some of the previous podcasts. But Willie, you've traveled to many places in the Middle East and Mediterranean for your research. What was one of the most interesting or surprising things you saw or learned on these trips?
Yeah, for the research for the books, the trilogy about the Nephilim, I and some very good friends of mine, we've traveled all over the ancient world, around the Black Sea area, many different countries in the ancient Middle East, or in the Middle East, and in the Mediterranean. But for the first volume, it was essentially and especially the Sumerian civilization that was of great interest, or that is of great interest. So visiting Iraq, where we have the ruins of this ancient civilization, that was to me an amazing experience. It's like Christians going to Israel for the first time, visiting Jerusalem, visiting the tomb of Jesus, all these things. It's really a real spiritual experience. And the same, when you visit these old cities, Eridu, spoken of in the Bible, and Uruk, Erech, in the biblical tradition, these old cities, Eridu, nowadays it's just, a heap of rubble, and it's just a desert area far from the sea. But in those days, it was in the marshlands. The Persian Gulf reached up until the city of Eridu. And I visit, for example, when we visited Iran, in the south of Iran, we visited some of these marshlands that has been preserved, beautifully preserved, exactly as it was in those ancient days. So you see these people, using a canoe to travel with great speed on these marshlands and throwing their nets, this ancient tradition that they have kept alive in these areas, so you get a good idea what it was like during that early period. And going to Uruk, that great city of the Uruk period, and see these ruins, these great that's a massive ruins,
Yep.
many great temples that were built there during the end of the Uruk period, the great walls that Gilgamesh has built according to tradition. And then the ziggurat of An, which actually, most likely, was the very first ziggurat ever built. And that was towards the end of the Uruk period. So, although the temple of An existed much earlier, the first ziggurat, was most likely built at this temple. And so it's just fascinating, to visit it, to walk there on these grounds, see these things. That's an amazing experience.
Just for the listeners or the viewers, Uruk is known as Varka today, and it's actually close to the ancient Euphrates River, which just paints that picture.
Yeah, the Euphrates actually once flew through Uruk, right through Uruk.
Yes.
And the temple of Inanna on the one hand and the temple of An on the other hand were on opposite sides of the river. Fascinating tradition, story.
That's absolutely amazing. So Willie, did visiting places like Egypt or ancient Sumerian sites actually help you understand the stories of the Nephilim kings better? And if you can, share an example with us.
I think a good example, for example, is Enmerkar. The epics of Enmerkar is the great heroic stories of this ancient king of Uruk, which I believe is the equivalent of Nimrod. The consonants are in both names are NMR, and we know the vowels change all the time, so the consonants are the same. So the name could be the same, and the stories are very similar. They live in exactly the same period. They were both kings of Uruk. But in his stories, we read how one of his messengers traveled to the north, to the land of Arata, through the Zagros mountains, through 9 mountain passes, seven mountain passes. And we decided to go and visit and see for ourselves where these passes are located. Now, what is interesting, if you go to Sumer or to the southern Mesopotamia, the Sumerians believed that their world was actually a representation of the world. And towards the south, in the Persian Gulf, this island of Dilmun was located. That's the island of Bahrain. And many of the dead were buried there. There's hundreds, thousands of burial tombs there. It's beautiful to visit Bahrain, to see all these tombs. And according to the Gilgamesh epic, the Sumerian Noah was actually found and resided on this Isle of the Blessed. So that was towards the south, and that was then associated with the deep under the world, the netherworld, of the blessed dead. And towards the north, the seven mountain ranges, that actually referred to the seven heavens, going up to the north.
Yeah, I just wanted to say you guys you've actually traveled the seven heavens,
Yeah, we traveled through the seven heavens, so to say. And after traveling, we actually carefully marked these seven passes that we traveled through. And I must mention the name of David Roll. He inspired me a lot in his writings, and he also did this tour. But anyhow, and then when I got to the north, eventually we come to the area that was believed to have been Eden. And what is fascinating is when you get to that area in the north, there's, for example, there's many beautiful places. The mountain of Sahant and how the people live within the mountain. A city nearby is called Malakan. And David Rolla has proposed that this name means guardian angels.
Yes.
Going back to the ancient, story about the guardian angels living close to Eden. And so what we can do is, if we go to this area particularly, agree closely with what the Bible says about the Garden of Eden and where the Garden of Eden was located. And for example, we read that this garden was in the north. It was in the headwaters, in the area of the headwaters of the different rivers, the four rivers, the heads. The word there means the headwaters. Some translations has removed the word heads, but it's there in the original. And the rivers, that's the Gihon, the Pishon, the Hiddekel, that's the Tigris, and the Euphrates.
Yes.
Now, they are all, the Tigris and Euphrates, both of them, the headwaters are in this area near Lake Van and Lake Urmia. The same regarding the Gihon. The Gihon, it's actually the Gayun. It's what's the ancient name found outside the Bible, which agrees with the Arrakis after the Islamic invasion of the Caucasus. That was the new name. That flows actually from this area towards the Caspian Sea, as well as another river in that same area. It's the Pishon, or the Ushum, that the P to and U exchange that one finds. And this river, actually, the source starts in this mountain, Sahant, that I've mentioned, and also flows towards the Caspian Sea. So all these rivers, their sources, are in this area. And this is a fascinating area. We visited, there's a little town next to Lake Urmia. It's also called the city of Urmia. And there's actually a grave, according to tradition, of one of the Magi, one of the three wise men that visited the baby Jesus. So this is a rich tradition, marvelous places. Takhtay Suleiman, also in this area, is just so beautiful, and you can't really express it in words. But so It's a fascinating to see how the celestial, the cosmic perspective, how that finds expression in the landscape of the ancient world. So,
yeah.
So they saw a close parallel between the celestial skies and the earth. And they believed that the way that they understood the earth, with Sumer being the middle point of the world, and Dilmun, or to the south in the Persian Gulf, referring to the blessed dead, the netherworld, and the seven mountain passes to the north. There's the seven planets, actually, and that's where the idea of the seven heavens originated. And according to St. Paul, he traveled past some of these heavens, and eventually he reached paradise, which corresponds with the Garden of Eden in the north. So it's fascinating.
It's fascinating, absolutely. And I mean, if you look at the traditions, if you look at Magare or Majere village, there's a lot of traditions around ancient beings surviving after the flood. And if you look at the Magi, the possibility that they've kept these Nephilim traditions, and talk about divine kings alive, and beautiful. Thanks for that explanation. So in your book, you talk about the Epic Age. What were some of the biggest achievements or stories from that time that people might not know about? Big question.
So the Epic Age, by the Epic Age, I understand basically two epic ages. The one is the Sumerian Epic Age, which happened during the Uruk period, and the other is the Akkadian Epic Age, slightly or a little bit later, a few hundred years later on. And this is the great heroic periods of ancient Sumerian tradition. When the Sumerians ruled the land, and they had these powerful and mighty kings that ruled during the Uruk period, and then the Akkadian kings, the Semites that lived in the city, they originated from the city of Kish, just to the north of Uruk. And they were really great warriors. They actually, Sargon the Great, he founded the first world empire. He ruled over the ends of the world, of the known ancient world, the ends of the world from the Mediterranean Sea, across the Persian Gulf, and his son Naram-Sin, he was also regarded and worshipped as a god in his own lifetime. And the stories about these kings, the Akkadian kings, their epic tales were told by poets already in their own lifetime. We discovered a text. It's from Ishnuna, and it dates from the time of Naram-Sin himself, where a student actually wrote a piece about these great victories. And these victories became great legends, and great myths evolved from them. But these great heroic tales, it's like the stories of Homer about the Trojan War. But this is long before that. And it's just fascinating. This heroic tradition, it fascinated me, to this day. And in my book, I explore these things, tell these stories, and to me, that's just a fascinating tale.
Absolutely, and things like Sargon, that may be the same person as the Bible's Nimrod, the mighty hunter of all cities. Just absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I would rather connect Nimrod with Enmerkar, earlier.
Yes,
not Sargon.
Yeah.
But anyhow, both regarded themselves, both dynasties. Regarded themselves as Nephilim, as being descended from the gods. Yeah.
Great. And Veli, so your book explores secret doctrines and myths of these ancient kings. What is one huge idea or mystery from the book that really surprised you during the research?
Yeah, so I really tried to carefully analyze these documents that present this oldest traditions of the Sumerians and Akkadians. And while studying these documents, I carefully analyzed what can be called the secret doctrine, the speculative theology, how they understood the world, how they understood their place in the world. And what is fascinating is that in the same way that their world on the ground was kind of a mirror image of the celestial skies. They saw themselves as descendants of the gods, as closely linked with the stars with which those gods were associated. For example, the Pleiades, the seven stars, which was on earth identified with the seven young men that marched with Lugalbanda towards Arata, the land in the north, biblical Ararat. So they saw the movement of the stars in the same way, or as a kind of blueprint for what happens on earth. That's fascinating. And we read in Sumer that they saw the movement of the stars as a celestial writing, the writing in the celestial skies. And we read quite often about that, and how the great sages, how they studied these writings in the celestial skies. And the Bible also talks about it, for example, in the book of Isaiah, Revelation, the heavens are referred to in terms of a scroll. So here we have again the writings in the celestial sky. So they believe this, but I call it the cosmic code, or the celestial code. So it's not, if one study the documents and so on, maybe, some people think they were primitive people, they didn't understand anything. But once you carefully study it, you find something different, very different. And for example, during the Uruk period, towards the end of the Uruk period, that was also the time when Tuban was the polar star. There are just two polar stars. And that was the time when Tuban was the polar star, exactly during that period. That was also the time of the Tower of Babel. So here we have this massively important cosmic event, celestial event, and this is exactly the time when these great things happened on earth. The same with regard to the Akkadian Empire. The Akkadian Empire came to its climax, to its greatest glory days towards the end of the age of Taurus. So again, we find the climax of the era of Taurus corresponding with this great empire, the first world empire. And this Taurus, the era of Taurus, the Sumerians, afterwards during the R3 period, they associated it with the bull of heaven. And Gilgamesh, the great Sumerian hero, he killed this bull, which is just a way to say that the era of Taurus had come to an end. But the bull was also associated with the Akkadians. It was the image that of great importance during the Akkadian period. And most scholars agree that this is also an image that was understood on a political level, that the Sumerians played a role in bringing the great Akkadian Empire to an end. Gilgamesh is a Sumerian hero. So this was celebrated in the R3 period, after the end of the Akkadian Empire. So what we find is, again, this close connection that they made between the celestial events, things that happened in terms of the starry heavens, and what happens on earth. And in my studies later on, I found exactly the same thing also for later periods. And that's why I coined this terminology, the cosmic code.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Fascinating.
Very visual.
Yeah.
So Willie, what is the main conclusion you came to about the Nephilim and their role in shaping ancient civilization?
When we read in Genesis 6, verse 4 about the Nephilim, we read that they were great heroes of old. And what I discovered is the greatest heroic epochs of the ancient world, the Uruk period and the Akkadian period, that was also the period when the dynasties believed themselves to have been scions of the gods. They were born from the gods. And this is quite significant. It's not just that They were great heroes. But the greatest heroic epochs, the greatest heroic tales goes back to these great Nephilim heroes, the greatest building project. So in later Sumerian times, later Mesopotamian times, the two images, the two kings that played the greatest role in later times were Gilgamesh, the archetype of the Sumerian hero, and Sargon, and also Naram-Sin to some extent, especially among the Assyrians, who regarded them as the greatest of all kings of all time. And later on in my studies, when I continued in my second volume and my third volume towards the Mediterranean world and Europe, I found exactly the same. The greatest heroic epochs in the world's history, the dynasties that ruled during that period, were regarded as Nephilim. They were the scions of the gods. And I think that's an important conclusion that I came to, and this is a kind of lead that I also followed throughout history, and this is what one of the conclusions I came to.
Yeah. It just everything fits and it paints this wonderful picture. And I think over the last 30 minutes, you've really painted a portrait for us. And I really want to recommend people to read the Nephilim Kings of an Epic Age, because it really uncovers the real historical roots of the Nephilim and reveals how these ancient god kings shaped the birth of civilization in an absolutely fresh and eye-opening way. What can I say? Thank you, Willie. I really appreciate it. Any final comment?
No, I believe the readers, the listeners, and those people that follow us on this channel, the community, they should read the books and inform themselves and get some background. I think many of those that have listened to quite a few episodes, if you start to bring all the things together, gain a good understanding of how these things come together, it's a good time to read the books and get all the details and really understand it. And it'll enable you to see the Bible and the ancient world in a totally new light.
Absolutely. So, final question for our followers. What do you think? Could the ancient Nephilim kings have really shaped our early civilization? We would love it if you guys could share your thoughts in the comments for our next episode. We might want to discuss it. Thank you very much. And Willie, thanks again. I appreciate it.
Thank you.